The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slid under Daniel Morrison's cabin door like a threat. Daniel, a 47-year-old civil engineer who'd inherited his grandfather's mountain property 3 years ago, read the words twice before his hands started shaking. Notice of easement seizure. Your private driveway has been deemed community property under HOA jurisdiction. Removal of gate required within 72 hours. For 6 months, the Mountain Vista HOA had been testing him. Small fines for unapproved landscaping, complaints about his truck being too commercial. But this crossed every line. What HOA President Patricia Hendricks didn't know was that Daniel's grandfather hadn't just left him a cabin. He'd left him something far more valuable. And in 72 hours, Patricia was about to discover that some property disputes have consequences that echo through entire communities. Before we dive into how a civil engineer used century-old property records to checkmate an entire HOA board, if you love stories where entitled people discover they've picked the wrong fight, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a property owner past his breaking point, the confrontation where hidden leverage shifted all power, and the resolution where an entire community learned the difference between authority and ownership. Daniel Morrison had spent 6 months enduring the Mountain Vista HOA's escalating demands, each one chipping away at the peaceful mountain retreat his grandfather had built 50 years ago. The harassment felt personal, targeted, relentless. But the driveway seizure wasn't just another power play. It was the catalyst that forced Daniel to open the metal filing cabinet his grandfather had told him to keep safe, just in case. Inside were property deeds, survey maps, and legal documents that would make Patricia Hendricks wish she'd never heard the name Morrison. The confrontation came at the monthly HOA meeting, in front of 40 homeowners who'd watched Patricia's reign with growing unease. Daniel arrived with a leather portfolio and the quiet confidence of someone holding cards nobody knew existed. When Patricia dismissed his objections with her signature condescension, Daniel asked one simple question that made the room go silent. The answer would reveal that the Mountain Vista community's access to the outside world depended entirely on one man's goodwill. And Patricia had just declared war on that man. The resolution unfolded over 14 days that transformed Mountain Vista from Patricia's personal kingdom into a humbled community, learning the cost of unchecked authority. What started as a property dispute became a masterclass in leverage, negotiation, and the permanent consequences of underestimating quiet people. The bridge that had carried residents to town for half a century suddenly became a bargaining chip that rewrote every power dynamic in the community. Justice wasn't served hot or cold. It was served with engineering precision and the weight of indisputable law. Here's exactly how it happened. Daniel Morrison had never wanted to be HOA enemy number 1. The 47-year-old civil engineer had moved to his grandfather's mountain cabin 3 years ago, seeking exactly what the property promised: peace, privacy, and a place to escape the chaos of Denver's construction projects. His grandfather, Thomas Morrison, had built the cabin in 1973 on 20 acres of pristine Colorado mountain land, back when Mountain Vista was just a handful of families who knew each other by name. Thomas had been the community's unofficial problem solver for decades, the guy who plowed roads in winter and organized volunteer fire watches in summer. When he passed in 2022, he'd left Daniel the property with one cryptic instruction: keep the metal filing cabinet in the workshop. Don't throw anything away. You'll know when you need it. For the first 2 years, Daniel had integrated smoothly into Mountain Vista. He worked remotely 3 days a week, spent weekends restoring his grandfather's workshop, and nodded politely at HOA meetings he rarely attended. The community had grown since his grandfather's time. What had been 20 families in the 70s had expanded to 63 homes, and with that growth came structure, or what Patricia Hendricks called structure. Patricia, 53, had moved to Mountain Vista 4 years ago from a gated community in Boulder. She'd been elected HOA president within 6 months, running on a platform of elevated standards and property value protection. Her husband, Richard, was a retired attorney who'd made his fortune in corporate litigation. Together, they'd transformed the laid-back mountain community into something that resembled a suburban homeowners association with teeth. The harassment started small, almost dismissible. Last November, Daniel received a violation notice for non-approved exterior paint color on his cabin. The cabin had been the same cedar stain for 50 years. When Daniel pointed this out at the monthly meeting, Patricia smiled tightly and explained that new guidelines required all structures to conform to an earth tone palette approved by the Architectural Committee. Daniel, wanting to avoid conflict, had the cabin restained in an approved shade that looked identical to the original. Cost, $800. In January, another notice arrived, this time for his Ford F-250 work truck. Commercial vehicles prohibited in residential driveways per revised community standards. Daniel's truck, which he used for site inspections and had parked in the same spot for 3 years, was suddenly a violation. He'd parked it behind his workshop after that, out of sight. But the escalation really began in March. Daniel had planted a vegetable garden where his grandfather's old garden had been, using the same plot of earth that had produced tomatoes and squash for decades. The violation notice came within a week. Unapproved agricultural activity visible from community roads. Gardens must be ornamental only and require Architectural Committee approval. Daniel had attended that HOA meeting, frustration finally overriding his desire for peace. 40 residents sat in folding chairs in the community center as Patricia, positioned at the head table like a judge at a bench, reviewed the agenda with military precision. When Daniel raised his hand during the violation review section, Patricia's expression shifted to something that looked almost pleased. "Mr. Morrison, your grandfather was a beloved member of this community," Patricia had said, her voice dripping with false warmth. "But times change, standards evolve. The vegetable garden disrupts the aesthetic harmony we've worked hard to establish. Surely you understand that your personal preferences can't supersede community values." Daniel had tried to explain that the garden was a family tradition, that his grandfather had fed half the community from that plot during hard winters. Patricia had cut him off with a raised hand. "Sentiment doesn't trump policy, Mr. Morrison. Remove the garden or face daily fines of $50. The vote had gone 6-3 in favor of enforcement, with only the older residents voting against. Daniel had left that meeting understanding that this wasn't about gardens or trucks or paint colors. This was about Patricia establishing that her authority was absolute. Daniel had called the county planning office the next day, spending 3 hours reviewing zoning laws and property rights. Agricultural activity was explicitly permitted on properties over 5 acres. The HOA had no legal authority to prohibit it. When he'd sent a certified letter to Patricia explaining this, citing specific county ordinances, her response had been swift and personal. 2 days later, he'd received violation notices for excessive firewood storage, unapproved workshop structure, and failure to maintain decorative landscaping standards. Each violation carried $50 daily fines. Patricia had even shown up at his property with Richard, her attorney husband, and 2 other board members for an inspection. Daniel had watched from his porch as they photographed his grandfather's workshop, the firewood he'd split for winter, the natural wildflower meadow his grandfather had cultivated. Patricia had looked directly at him as they left, her smile sharp. "Compliance creates harmony, Mr. Morrison. I hope you'll learn that before this becomes more unpleasant." That had been 3 weeks ago. Daniel had contacted a local attorney who specialized in property law, spending $2,000 on a consultation that confirmed what he already knew. The HOA was overstepping its authority, but fighting them would require litigation that could drag on for years and cost tens of thousands of dollars. "Sometimes it's cheaper to comply or move," the attorney had advised. Daniel had gone home that night and sat in his grandfather's workshop, surrounded by tools that had built half the homes in Mountain Vista. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Stand your ground when it matters, Danny, but choose your ground carefully." Daniel had decided to pay the fines, remove the garden, and minimize his interactions with the HOA. He'd thought that would be the end of it. Then the certified letter arrived on Tuesday morning. Daniel had been reviewing structural plans for a bridge rehabilitation project in Fort Collins when he heard the sound of something sliding under his door. The envelope was thick, official, stamped with the Mountain Vista HOA seal that Patricia had commissioned last year. Inside, the letter was typed on expensive letterhead and signed by Patricia in bold blue ink. Notice of easement seizure. In accordance with Mountain Vista HOA Bylaws Section 12.4, your private driveway extending from Morrison Cabin to County Road 47 has been deemed a community asset vital to emergency access and fire safety. Effective immediately, said driveway is declared an easement under HOA jurisdiction. Your gate blocking community access must be removed within 72 hours. Failure to comply will result in forced removal and assessment of all costs to your property account, plus daily fines of $200. Daniel read the letter 3 times, his engineering mind struggling to process the audacity. His driveway was a quarter-mile private road his grandfather had built in 1973, maintained entirely at family expense for 50 years. It connected his cabin to the county road. It crossed no other properties. The gate at the road junction had been there for decades, installed after a series of break-ins in the 80s. The letter claimed emergency access, but Daniel's property was the last cabin on the mountain. There were no homes beyond his. The driveway provided access to nothing except his land. This wasn't about emergency access. This was Patricia Hendricks declaring that nothing in Mountain Vista existed outside her control, not even private property with clear, recorded deeds. Daniel sat at his grandfather's workbench, the letter trembling in his hands, and made a decision. He'd been patient. He'd been reasonable. He tried to avoid conflict, but Patricia had just crossed from harassment into theft. She was trying to seize his family's private property through bureaucratic intimidation. And in doing so, she'd finally pushed him to the point his grandfather had anticipated. Daniel walked to the metal filing cabinet in the corner of the workshop, the one his grandfather had told him to keep safe. He'd looked through it once, briefly, after the funeral, seeing old property deeds and survey maps and legal documents he hadn't understood the significance of. Now, with Patricia's letter in his hand, Daniel opened the cabinet with purpose. Inside, arranged in carefully labeled folders, was his grandfather's legacy. And as Daniel began reading, a smile crossed his face for the first time in months. If Patricia wanted to play property law games, she just activated someone who actually understood what property his grandfather owned. The monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m., exactly 67 hours after Patricia's letter had been delivered. Daniel arrived at 6:45, carrying a worn leather portfolio his grandfather had used for engineering projects. The Mountain Vista Community Center was already filling with residents, the usual mix of retirees, young families, and professionals who'd moved to the mountains for peace. Patricia sat at the head table with Richard and 4 other board members, reviewing papers with the self-satisfied air of someone who believed the outcome was predetermined. Daniel took a seat in the back row, portfolio on his lap, and waited. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7 sharp, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been effectively challenged. The first 30 minutes covered routine business, landscaping contracts, snow removal budgets, architectural review approvals. Then Patricia reached the agenda item that made several residents shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Item 7, enforcement action regarding Morrison property easement. Patricia looked directly at Daniel, her expression mixing pity with triumph. Mr. Morrison, you've had 67 hours to comply with the easement notice. I assume you're here to confirm the gate removal. Daniel stood, portfolio under his arm, and walked to the front of the room with the measured pace of someone who'd spent decades presenting engineering assessments to skeptical clients. Actually, Patricia, I'm here to discuss property rights, specifically the difference between HOA authority and legal ownership. The room went quiet. Patricia's smile tightened. Mr. Morrison, the HOA bylaws clearly grant us authority over community access and safety. Your private driveway is private property, Daniel interrupted calmly. Recorded in Jefferson County property records since 1973, built and maintained entirely by my family. It crosses no other lots, provides access to no other homes, and serves no community function. You have no legal authority to declare it an easement. He opened his portfolio and pulled out a document, holding it up. This is the original survey map from 1973. Would you like me to explain what it shows? Patricia's expression shifted from annoyed to calculating. Richard, her attorney husband, leaned over and whispered something. Patricia nodded and turned back to Daniel with forced patience. Mr. Morrison, perhaps you need to consult with a property attorney before making accusations. The HOA has legal counsel who's reviewed this matter thoroughly. She gestured to Richard, who straightened in his chair. The community's emergency access needs supersede individual property preferences. That's established law. Daniel nodded slowly, as if considering this. That's interesting, because I spent the last 2 days reviewing not just my property records, but all the property records for Mountain Vista. Would you like to know what I found? He didn't wait for an answer. My grandfather, Thomas Morrison, didn't just own the 20 acres where my cabin sits. In 1971, 2 years before he built the cabin, he purchased a crucial piece of land from Jefferson County during a surplus auction. A piece of land that every single resident of Mountain Vista uses every single day. The room had gone completely silent now. Even Patricia's confident expression showed the first crack of uncertainty. What are you talking about? She demanded. Daniel pulled another document from his portfolio, this one older, the paper yellowed but the ink still clear. This is the deed to Morrison Bridge, the only bridge crossing the gorge between Mountain Vista and County Road 12, the bridge that provides the only vehicle access to this community from town. The reaction was immediate. Residents turned to each other, confused whispers filling the room. Patricia stood abruptly. That bridge is county property. It's maintained by me, Daniel said quietly. Well, by my family. My grandfather bought the bridge and the land on both sides when the county couldn't afford maintenance costs in 1971. He maintained it himself for 50 years. When the county offered to buy it back in the 90s, my grandfather refused because he didn't trust them to keep up with repairs. The deed is clear. Morrison Bridge, including the approach roads on both sides, is private property, my property. As of my grandfather's death, I own the only vehicle access in and out of Mountain Vista. Richard was on his feet now, his attorney instincts overriding his board member role. That's impossible. I've reviewed the community property records. There's no mention of. Daniel turned to him with the expression of an engineer presenting calculations to someone who'd insisted 2 plus 2 equaled 5. That's because nobody bothered to look at the county records from before the HOA existed. My grandfather maintained the bridge quietly. Never charged tolls, never restricted access, never made it an issue. He believed in community. But the deed explicitly states that Morrison Bridge is private property with no public easement unless granted by the owner. Daniel paused, letting that sink in. My grandfather granted that access verbally as a courtesy. I inherited the property 3 years ago. I've continued that courtesy, until now. Patricia had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. You're threatening to block community access. That's extortion, Mr. Morrison. You can't. I'm not threatening anything, Daniel interrupted, his voice still calm but with an edge that made several residents lean forward. I'm explaining property rights, the same property rights you've been violating with your easement seizure. You see, Patricia, I looked up HOA bylaws section 12.4 that you cited in your letter. Want to know what it actually says? He pulled out a printed copy of the bylaws. It grants the HOA authority over common areas and shared easements. It says nothing about seizing private property. You fabricated authority you don't have and attempted to steal my family's driveway through intimidation. The room had shifted now. Residents were no longer looking at Daniel with confusion, but at Patricia with growing concern. One of the older residents, Margaret Chen, who'd been friends with Daniel's grandfather, raised her hand. Patricia, is this true? Did you try to take Daniel's driveway? Patricia's composure was cracking. This community needs emergency access. Thomas Morrison always cooperated with. My grandfather cooperated because people treated him with respect, Daniel said, his voice rising slightly. Because this was a community, not a dictatorship. You've spent 6 months harassing me, fabricating violations, imposing illegal fines, and now you've attempted to seize private property. So here's what's going to happen. Daniel placed both hands on the table in front of Patricia, his engineer's drawings and property deeds spread out like evidence at a trial. Tomorrow morning, I'm installing a gate at Morrison Bridge. It will have a keypad. I will provide codes to all current residents except the HOA board members. Those codes will be changed monthly. The room erupted. Residents shouting questions, board members trying to call for order, Patricia's face flushing red with rage. Daniel raised his voice over the chaos. The gate stays until the HOA board formally rescinds the easement seizure of my driveway, issues written apologies for all fabricated violations from the past 6 months, and refunds every dollar in illegal fines you've charged me. Additionally, Patricia Hendricks and Richard Hendricks will resign from the board. Patricia slammed her hand on the table. You can't hold the entire community hostage because of a personal dispute. Someone call the sheriff. Please do, Daniel said calmly. I'll show them the property deed. I'll show them your letter attempting to seize my driveway, and I'll ask them who's actually breaking the law here. He looked around the room at the assembled residents. I don't want to restrict access. My grandfather built that bridge for this community, but I will not be bullied. I will not have my family's property stolen by someone who thinks HOA presidency means unlimited authority. You have 24 hours to meet my terms. Otherwise, tomorrow morning, Mountain Vista becomes a gated community, and I own the gate. Daniel collected his documents, placed them back in the portfolio, and walked toward the door. Behind him, the meeting dissolved into chaos. Patricia was shouting about legal action. Richard was on his phone, presumably calling an attorney, and residents were surrounding board members demanding explanations. Margaret Chen caught Daniel at the door, her elderly face creased with concern. "Danny, your grandfather wouldn't want the community punished because of Patricia's behavior." Daniel looked at the woman who'd brought his grandfather soup when he was sick, who'd helped his grandmother in her final years. "You're right, Mrs. Chen, but my grandfather also taught me that sometimes you have to show people the difference between power and authority. Patricia has spent 6 months proving she'll abuse any authority given to her. Tomorrow she learns what real leverage looks like." He handed Mrs. Chen a piece of paper. "Here's the gate code. It'll work through all of this. My fight isn't with the community. It's with people who think being elected to a board means they own everyone else's property." As Daniel drove home that night, his phone began ringing with calls from board members, residents, and eventually Richard Hendricks himself. Daniel sent every call to voicemail. He'd said everything that needed saying. Now came the part his grandfather had taught him during years of engineering negotiations. After you present the facts, you let the other side realize they have no good options. And Patricia Hendricks, for the first time in her 4-year reign as HOA president, had no options at all. The gate went up at 6 a.m. Friday morning. Daniel had hired a professional installation company from Denver, and they worked with efficient speed. 2 stone pillars flanking the approach to Morrison Bridge, a wrought iron gate between them, and a commercial-grade keypad system that Daniel had programmed himself. The bridge his grandfather had maintained for 50 years now had a guardian, and that guardian was done being patient. By 7 a.m., the first residents heading to town for work found themselves stopped at the gate. Daniel had left his phone number on a sign with clear instructions. "Private property. Access granted to Mountain Vista residents via code. Contact property owner for access code." His phone began ringing immediately. Daniel answered each call with the same calm message. Current residents could receive a code by providing proof of residency. Board members needed to meet his stated terms first. By 8 a.m., 17 families had codes. By 9 a.m., the county sheriff had arrived. Deputy Marcus Williams had known Thomas Morrison personally. He'd been the deputy who'd helped Thomas organize neighborhood watch programs in the 80s. Now he stood at the gate with Daniel, reviewing the property deed with the careful attention of someone who'd seen enough disputes to know when someone had the law on their side. "Danny, I knew your grandfather maintained this bridge, but I didn't realize he owned it outright." Daniel nodded. "Most people didn't. He never made it an issue. But Patricia Hendricks tried to seize my driveway yesterday. That made it an issue." Deputy Williams looked at the HOA letter Daniel provided, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to barely concealed disgust. "This is way outside HOA authority. They can't just declare private property an easement." He handed the letter back. "Legally, you're within your rights to control access to your property. But Danny, there are families up there, kids who need to get to school, people who work in town. Every current resident except the board members has a code," Daniel said. "I've provided alternative routes for emergency vehicles through my property directly. Fire, ambulance, police all have access. This isn't about punishing the community. It's about showing Patricia Hendricks that authority has limits." Deputy Williams sighed, the sound of a man caught between law and practicality. "She's already called the county attorney's office. They're going to make noise about this." "Let them," Daniel replied. "I'm a civil engineer. I've spent 20 years dealing with property law and right-of-way disputes. I know exactly what ground I'm standing on. And Patricia just learned that sometimes the quiet guy in the back of the meeting room is quiet because he doesn't need to make noise to have power." By noon, the situation had reached critical mass. Parents were calling board members. Workers were late to jobs, and the community Facebook page had exploded with arguments about whose fault this was. A clear division emerged. Newer residents, who'd moved to Mountain Vista during Patricia's reign and bought into her elevated standards vision, blamed Daniel for holding the community hostage. Older residents, who remembered Thomas Morrison and the community he'd helped build, blamed Patricia for pushing a good man too far. The board called an emergency meeting for 2 p.m. Daniel didn't attend. He spent the afternoon in his workshop doing what his grandfather had taught him. When you've presented your terms, you let the pressure work. His phone rang constantly. Angry voicemails from Richard Hendricks threatening legal action. Pleading messages from board members asking him to be reasonable, but also messages of support. Margaret Chen called to say she'd spoken to 20 other longtime residents, and they were demanding Patricia's resignation. Mike Reeves, who'd lived in Mountain Vista for 30 years, left a message saying, "Your grandfather helped me build my house in 1989. He never asked for anything in return. Patricia's been trying to run this place like a corporation instead of a community. Don't back down, Danny." The breakthrough came at 4:30 p.m. Daniel's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, a woman's voice he didn't know said, "Mr. Morrison, my name is Jennifer Walsh. I'm an attorney representing the Mountain Vista HOA board. I've been reviewing the situation and I'd like to discuss a resolution." Daniel leaned against his workbench. "I stated my terms yesterday. Have they been met?" There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "Mr. Morrison, the board is willing to formally rescind the driveway easement claim and refund the fines from the past 6 months. However, they're requesting that you be reasonable about the bridge access. Families are being disrupted." "I've provided access to every resident except the people who tried to steal my property," Daniel interrupted. "Emergency services have full access. The only people inconvenienced are the board members who created this situation. My terms included resignations. Have Patricia and Richard Hendricks resigned?" Another pause. "They're willing to step down from board positions if you restore full access immediately." Daniel considered this. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory again. "Know when you've won, Danny. Victory isn't about humiliation. It's about establishing that there are consequences for crossing lines." Daniel spoke carefully. "Here are my revised terms. The HOA formally rescinds the easement seizure in writing. All fines from the past 6 months are refunded with interest. Patricia and Richard Hendricks resign from the board effective immediately. The HOA agrees in writing that they have no authority over private property outside recorded easements and common areas. And one more thing." "What's that?" Jennifer Walsh asked, sounding cautious. "The community votes on a new HOA charter that includes term limits for board positions and requires board decisions affecting individual properties to be approved by majority vote of all residents, not just board members. Until that charter is ratified, I maintain the right to restrict board member access to the bridge. Residents get full access immediately. Board members get access after the new charter passes." Jennifer Walsh was quiet for a long moment. "That's essentially restructuring the HOA's entire governance." "Yes," Daniel agreed, "because what Patricia created wasn't governance, it was tyranny. My grandfather believed in community, real community, where people look out for each other and respect each other's property and rights. That's what I'm fighting for. Tell the board they have until 8 a.m. Monday to provide written agreement to all terms. Otherwise, the gate stays as is indefinitely." The weekend passed in tense waiting. Daniel spent Saturday morning processing access code requests from more residents, each one thanking him and apologizing for Patricia's behavior. He spent the afternoon reviewing the structural integrity of Morrison Bridge, something his grandfather had taught him to do quarterly. The bridge was solid. Thomas Morrison had built things to last. Sunday morning, Margaret Chen and 5 other longtime residents showed up at Daniel's cabin with coffee and breakfast sandwiches. They sat on his porch, these people who'd known his grandfather, and told stories about the community mountain Vista used to be. Thomas organized our first 4th of July picnic in 1975, Margaret said, her eyes distant with memory. Half the families were struggling. Your grandfather provided all the food, wouldn't accept repayment. He said community wasn't about accounting, it was about caring. She looked at Daniel with fierce approval. He'd be proud of what you're doing. Patricia turned this place into something Thomas wouldn't recognize. Sometimes you have to tear down what's broken before you can rebuild what matters. Monday morning at 7:55 a.m., Jennifer Walsh called. Mr. Morrison, the board has agreed to all your terms. I'm sending the written agreements via email now. Patricia and Richard Hendricks submitted their resignations last night. The community vote on the new charter is scheduled for 2 weeks from today. Daniel opened his email, reviewed the documents with an engineer's attention to detail, and confirmed every term was explicitly stated. I'll remove bridge restrictions for board members within the hour, but I'm keeping the gate structure. My property, my right. Residents will continue to have codes. Consider it a reminder. That's your right, Jennifer Walsh agreed. Mr. Morrison, for what it's worth, I've reviewed Patricia's actions over the past 6 months. The violations she issued were legally questionable at best. You'd have grounds for a lawsuit. Daniel considered this, then shook his head even though she couldn't see it. My grandfather taught me that revenge and justice aren't the same thing. Justice is restoring balance. Revenge is tipping the scales the other direction. I have what I wanted, my property rights respected, illegal harassment stopped, and community governance reformed. That's enough. He paused. But Jennifer, make sure the new board understands something. My family has been part of Mountain Vista for over 50 years. We helped build this community, and I will protect it from anyone, board member, resident, or outside entity, who tries to turn it into something based on control instead of cooperation. That bridge is a reminder that real power comes from building things that matter, not from bullying people who do. The community charter vote passed 2 weeks later with 87% approval. The new governance structure included term limits, resident voting requirements, and explicit protections for private property rights. Patricia and Richard Hendricks listed their home for sale 3 weeks after their resignations. The day the moving trucks came, Daniel stood on his porch and watched. He felt no satisfaction in their departure, only relief that the chapter had closed. Margaret Chen had told him that Patricia tried to claim Daniel had forced them out. But the truth was simpler. When your authority comes from intimidation rather than respect, losing that authority means losing your position entirely. 2 months after the gate went up, Daniel sat on his porch on a Saturday afternoon, watching the sun set over the mountains his grandfather had loved. The bridge stood solid below, the gate open as it usually was now, residents coming and going freely. His phone rang. It was Mike Reeves, the longtime resident who'd supported him through the conflict. Danny, we're organizing a community workday next month. Thought we'd clean up the common areas, do some trail maintenance, maybe repair that pavilion in the park. Your grandfather used to organize these back in the day. Would you lead it? Daniel smiled, the first truly peaceful smile he'd felt in months. I'd be honored. As he ended the call, he looked at the metal filing cabinet visible through his workshop window, the cabinet his grandfather had told him to keep safe. Inside were documents that had shifted power, protected rights, and ultimately restored balance. But the real inheritance wasn't the deeds or the bridge or the property. It was the lesson his grandfather had spent 50 years demonstrating. Community built on respect and mutual support lasts. Community built on control and intimidation crumbles the moment someone stands up and says, "No more." The gate to Morrison Bridge remained, a permanent structure now softened with climbing roses that Daniel had planted last month. It stood open most days, a threshold rather than a barrier. But every resident who passed through it knew what it represented. Not Daniel's power over them, but the reminder that power used to serve community builds connections. Power used to control community builds only resentment and resistance. Patricia Hendricks had learned that the hard way. And Mountain Vista returned to its founding principles of mutual respect and cooperation, was stronger for the lesson. Across the country in Savannah, Georgia, retired Judge Alina Martinez was reviewing her property tax bill when she noticed something wrong. The city had assessed her historic home at triple its actual value. When she called to correct the error, the clerk dismissed her concerns. "Ma'am, the assessment is final." Alina smiled, the same calm smile she'd worn while presiding over cases for 30 years, and pulled out her property deed. "That's interesting," she said quietly. "Because this deed shows I own not just my home, but the alley system that 3 city parking garages use for access. Would you like to discuss reassessment, or should I discuss revoking the city's access easement?" The clerk went silent. "But that's a story for another time."